You ate less, moved more, and lost weight. Then you stopped losing, and then you regained slowly, relentlessly, despite maintaining the diet and the exercise that produced the loss. You blamed yourself. Millions of people have arrived at this conclusion, and they are all wrong in exactly one way because the failure was not theirs. 5 independent biological systems, each operating through a different organ, through a different molecular pathway, were converging on a single objective the entire time: restore the weight you lost. None of them are willpower, none of them are under your conscious control, and none of them were explained to you during the decades you spent blaming yourself. 5 systems, 1 objective, this is what they are. Now the first system, because this is the one that makes the math stop working. When you lose weight, your metabolic rate drops. A smaller body requires fewer calories, that part is expected. What was not expected until it was measured is that the metabolic rate drops more than the size reduction predicts. Someone who lost weight to reach 75 kilograms burns 300 to 500 fewer calories per day than someone who was always 75 kilograms, as Leibel and Rosenbaum documented at Columbia University. Identical weight, identical height, identical body composition, dramatically different metabolic rate. Body does not simply adjust to the new size. It overshoots downward, actively suppressing metabolic rate below what the physics of the new body requires. Hypothalamus, reading the reduced leptin signal from shrunken fat cells, reduces thyroid hormone output, increases metabolic efficiency in skeletal muscle so that identical work costs fewer calories, and reduces sympathetic nervous system tone to metabolically active tissues. The body becomes a more efficient machine at exactly the moment you need it to be a less efficient one. Overshooting is not temporary. Contestants from The Biggest Loser who lost extreme amounts of weight through diet and exercise still had metabolic rates suppressed below predicted levels 6 years after the competition, as Fothergill and colleagues documented. 6 years. The hypothalamus had not recalibrated to the new weight. It was still defending the old weight by maintaining metabolic suppression that made regain thermodynamically inevitable unless you ate significantly less than someone of identical size who had never lost weight. Someone who lost 10 kilograms, maintained the loss for a year, and then regained despite eating the same as before, was eating the same, but the body was burning 300 to 500 fewer calories per day than it burned at that weight before the loss. Identical intake that produced a deficit at the beginning produced a surplus a year later. Not because you ate more, but because the body burned less. The math changed while you did not. Second system is invisible. Non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT, encompasses every calorie burned through movement that is not deliberate exercise, fidgeting, posture maintenance, standing up and sitting down, gesturing while talking, walking between rooms, tapping feet, shifting weight, adjusting position in a chair. The cumulative energy cost of these unconscious movements ranges from 350 to 1,000 calories per day between individuals, as Levin documented at the Mayo Clinic, a variation larger than most people's entire exercise expenditure. Levine's critical finding: when people are in caloric deficit, NEAT drops, unconsciously. You fidget less, sit more, stand less, gesture less during conversation, take fewer unnecessary steps, hold your body more still. None of these changes are conscious decisions. The hypothalamus, reading the energy deficit through leptin and other metabolic signals, reduces the neural drive to the motor circuits that produce non-exercise movement. The body becomes stiller, conserving energy through hundreds of micro-reductions in movement that the conscious mind never detects. Magnitude: a 300 to 500 calorie per day reduction in NEAT can equal or exceed the caloric deficit you created through deliberate diet restriction. You cut 500 calories from your diet. Your NEAT drops by 400. The net deficit is 100, a fraction of what you intended. The body matched the dietary restriction with an unconscious movement reduction that you cannot see, cannot feel, and do not know is happening. If you say, "I'm doing everything right and I'm not losing weight," you may be correct. Your conscious behaviors are unchanged. What changed is the behavior they cannot observe. The 1,000 small movements per day that burned 400 to 600 calories are now burning 200 to 300 because the nervous system reduced the motor output without filing a report. And then the third system, because this one is structural and it does not reverse. Fat cells do not disappear when you lose weight. You shrink them, Each adipocyte releases its stored triglyceride, decreases in volume, and remains in place a smaller cell in its original location, with identical blood supply, identical innervation, identical receptor profile. When you regain weight, those cells refill. They were never gone, they were waiting. Total number of fat cells in the human body is established during childhood and adolescence and remains essentially constant in adulthood, approximately 30 billion adipocytes, as Spaulding and colleagues documented in Nature using carbon-14 dating of adipocyte DNA. The technique exploited the atmospheric carbon-14 spike from nuclear testing in the 1950s and 60s to determine when individual fat cells were born. The finding: fat cells are added during growth, and the total number persists for life. Adults do not gain or lose fat cells. They fill or empty the ones they have. Someone who was 100 kilograms and dieted to 75 has the same number of fat cells as at 100. Each cell is smaller, but each cell is also signaling producing leptin proportional to how full it is relative to its maximum capacity. A cell that was full at 100 and is now half empty at 75 produces a leptin signal that says depleted. 30 billion cells, all producing an identical signal. The hypothalamus receives 30 billion reports of depletion and responds accordingly. Increase hunger, decrease satiety, decrease metabolic rate, decrease NEAT, increase reward sensitivity to food. Entire hormonal defense is proportional to how many fat cells are signaling depletion. Someone who was always 75 kilograms has fat cells at their normal fullness. The leptin signal is adequate. Someone who lost weight to 75 has fat cells at half their historical capacity. The leptin signal is starving. Identical weight, identical BMI, completely different hormonal environment. You are living in a body that is biochemically convinced it is starving because 30 billion empty containers are telling the brain exactly that. You now know what the body does when weight drops: metabolic suppression, movement reduction, and 30 billion cells screaming depletion. The question changes from what the body does to why it coordinates the response through a single signal. Now leptin. Because this is the thermostat. Leptin is produced by fat cells in proportion to fat mass. The hypothalamus reads, circulating leptin as a fuel gauge. High leptin means adequate stores, low leptin means depletion. The hypothalamus has a set point, a leptin level. It defends as normal, calibrated over months and years by the average fat mass the body has maintained. When fat mass decreases and leptin drops below the set point, the hypothalamus activates a coordinated defense. Ghrelin from the stomach increases and you feel hungrier. Peptide Y and cholecystokinin from the gut decrease and you feel less full after meals. Reward sensitivity in the nucleus accumbens increases and food produces more dopamine per bite, making eating more pleasurable and harder to stop. The metabolic rate decreases through the thyroid suppression already described. NEAT decreases through the motor output reduction already described. 5 simultaneous mechanisms: hunger up, satiety down, reward up, metabolism down, movement down, all coordinated by the hypothalamus in response to a single signal. Leptin is below the set point. Set point is not fixed forever. It can recalibrate, but slowly, over months to years of maintained weight, as the hypothalamus gradually accepts the new leptin level as normal. The recalibration is why sustained weight loss is possible but requires years of maintenance before the hormonal defense fully stands down. Someone who lost weight and maintained it for 3 months has not recalibrated. Someone who maintained it for 3 years has partially recalibrated. The defense weakens over time, but it does not disappear quickly, and during the years of active defense, every day requires maintaining a caloric intake below what the body's hormonal environment is demanding. The hunger is real, the reduced satiety is real, the increased food reward is real, and none of them are character flaws. They are endocrine outputs from a hypothalamus that has detected a leptin drop and is executing the program evolution designed to prevent starvation. Program does not know about diets or body image. It knows one thing: fuel stores have decreased and the organism must eat more and move less until they are restored. Well, why it converges after 45? Because every mechanism described above is compounded by age-related changes you have already been experiencing. Basal metabolic rate declines approximately 1 to 2% per decade after 30, driven by the sarcopenia that reduces muscle mass. Less muscle means less metabolically active tissue, fewer calories burned at rest. At 55, you burn approximately 100 to 200 fewer calories per day at rest than at 35, purely from reduced muscle mass. NEAT declines with age, independently of diet. You move less spontaneously, fidget less, maintain more static postures. The baseline NEAT that the hypothalamus can reduce during dieting is already lower before the reduction begins. Hormonal changes shift fat storage patterns, declining testosterone in men and declining estrogen in women, particularly post-menopause, redirect fat from subcutaneous depots to visceral depots. Visceral fat, the endocrine organ, a prior discussion, described produces inflammatory signals that impair the metabolic flexibility caloric restriction requires. Insulin sensitivity declines. An identical meal produces a larger insulin response at 55 than at 35, driving more glucose into fat storage and producing a deeper post-meal blood sugar drop that triggers hunger sooner. The viewer who feels hungrier after meals at 55 than they did at 35 is not imagining it. The insulin dynamics have changed. Sleep quality declines. Reduced, slow-wave sleep impairs growth hormone release, increases cortisol, and disrupts leptin and ghrelin cycling. Sleeping 6 hours produces a measurably higher hunger drive and lower metabolic rate the following day than sleeping 7.5 to 8 independent of diet and exercise. Sleep-weight connection operates through a specific hormonal sequence that unfolds across a single bad night. Reduced slow-wave sleep decreases growth hormone release. Growth hormone is the primary signal for overnight fat mobilization, the process by which stored fat is made available as fuel during the fasting period of sleep. Without adequate growth hormone, the body mobilizes less fat overnight and wakes with lower blood glucose, triggering higher cortisol and higher ghrelin, both increasing appetite and reducing the metabolic flexibility that allows switching between fat and glucose as fuel. One bad night produces a measurably different hormonal environment the following day. Chronic short sleep produces a persistently shifted baseline that compounds every other mechanism in the convergence. Alcohol adds a metabolic complication that most calorie-counting approaches underweight. Alcohol provides 7 calories per gram, nearly as energy-dense as fat, but the body cannot store it. Ethanol is metabolically toxic and must be processed first, before fat, before carbohydrate, before protein. When you drink alcohol with a meal, the liver prioritizes alcohol metabolism, and the calories from the food, particularly the fat, are more likely to be stored because the metabolic machinery is occupied processing the ethanol. 2 glasses of wine with dinner adds approximately 250 calories from the alcohol, while simultaneously increasing storage of calories from the meal. The net caloric impact is larger than the alcohol calories alone. And the sleep disruption that alcohol produces, suppressing REM and slow-wave sleep in the second half of the night, impairs the growth hormone release described above, adding a hormonal cost on top of the caloric one. Social eating produces intake increases that are not driven by hunger and therefore not regulated by the satiety systems. Eating with others increases meal size by 30 to 40%, compared to eating alone. Conversation extends the meal duration. Social pressure normalizes larger portions, and attentional focus shifts from internal satiety signals to external social cues. Eating moderately during weekday meals alone, but overeating during weekend meals with family or friends, adds 500 to 1,000 calories per week that the weekday deficit was supposed to compensate for. The implication is not to eat alone. Social meals are valuable. The implication is that the caloric cost of social eating is real and invisible, and accounting for weekday intake, but not weekend social meals, explains many plateaus. At 55, eating and exercising identically to how you did at 35 produces weight gain, not because you changed, but because 5 age-related physiological changes shifted the thermodynamic balance. Lower metabolic rate, lower NEAT, hormonal fat redistribution, increased insulin response, and impaired sleep, each one adding 50 to 100 calories per day to the wrong side of the energy equation. Combined, 250 to 500 calories per day of thermodynamic disadvantage that did not exist 20 years ago. Thermic effect of food matters here, because not all calories are equal inside the body, even though they are equal on the label. Protein costs 20 to 30% of its own caloric content just to digest the metabolic work of breaking peptide bonds, deaminating amino acids, and converting them to usable substrates burns a significant fraction of the energy the protein contains. 100 calories of protein delivers 70 to 80 net calories after the thermic cost. Fat costs 0 to 3%. 100 calories of fat delivers 97 to 100 net calories. Carbohydrate costs 5 to 10%. Practical consequence: shifting a portion of caloric intake from fat to protein at identical total calories increases the thermic cost of digestion, increases the satiety signal per calorie through peptide YY and GLP-1 stimulation in the gut, and provides the amino acids that resistance training needs to maintain muscle mass during caloric deficit. The macronutrient composition changes the thermodynamic reality inside the body without changing the number on the calorie label. The viewer who eats 1800 calories of primarily protein and complex carbohydrate nets fewer usable calories and feels fuller than someone eating 1800 calories of primarily fat, and the body's hormonal response to the two meals is different despite the identical calorie count. And then what actually works when the physics is understood, because the interventions change once you know what you are fighting. Sustained moderate deficit rather than aggressive restriction. A 300 to 500 calorie daily deficit triggers a milder defensive response than a 1,000 calorie deficit. The metabolic adaptation is dose dependent. Larger deficits produce larger suppression. Losing half a kilogram per week maintains more of the metabolic rate than losing a kilogram per week. The slower loss is thermodynamically more sustainable because it provokes less of the hormonal defense. Resistance training to preserve muscle. The metabolic rate decline during weight loss is partly driven by muscle loss. The body catabolizes muscle for amino acids during energy deficit. Resistance training provides the mechanical loading signal that tells the body to preserve muscle even during deficit. Dieting without resistance training loses both fat and muscle. Dieting with resistance training loses primarily fat and preserves the metabolic engine. Exercise compensation next, because this is the mechanism that makes the gym less effective than the effort suggests. Deliberate exercise burns calories, but the body compensates for deliberate exercise by reducing NEAT in the hours after. As Roland described in the activity stat hypothesis, children given structured exercise reduce their spontaneous activity by an equivalent amount. Adults show partial compensation. The 300 calories burned during a morning walk may be partially offset by 200 fewer calories of unconscious movement during the rest of the day. Net expenditure from the exercise is 100 calories, not 300. Compensation is why exercise alone, without dietary change, produces modest weight loss, typically 2 to 3 kilograms over 12 weeks, far less than the caloric expenditure would predict if the body did not compensate. Exercise is essential for cardiovascular function, for muscle preservation, for mood, but it is a less effective weight loss tool than the calorie math suggests because the body partially erases the expenditure through NEAT reduction. Yo-yo dieting, the repeated cycle of losing and regaining, may compound the problem. Each cycle of weight loss and regain potentially recalibrates the set point slightly upward. The hypothalamus, having experienced a period of starvation followed by recovery, adjusts its defended weight higher as a buffer against future deprivation. People who have lost and regained weight multiple times consistently report that each successive loss is harder to achieve and easier to reverse than the previous one. Metabolic adaptation from each dieting episode may also accumulate. If the suppression from one diet does not fully resolve before the next begins, the suppression stack's metabolic rate drops from a baseline already suppressed from the previous attempt. The Fothergill data showing persistent suppression at 6 years suggests that full metabolic recovery may take longer than the interval between most people's dieting attempts. Each yo-yo cycle may be starting from a lower metabolic floor than the previous one. Gut microbiome adds a dimension the hormonal model does not capture. The bacterial population in your gut affects how efficiently you extract calories from food. Two people eating identical meals in identical amounts may absorb different numbers of calories because their gut bacteria process the food differently. The microbiome composition shifts during weight loss and may shift back during regain, contributing to the metabolic environment that favors restoration of the lost weight. Antibiotics, artificial sweeteners, processed food, and reduced fiber intake all alter the microbiome in directions that some research associates with increased caloric extraction efficiency, meaning the modern Western diet may be cultivating a gut bacterial population that is better at extracting energy from food, compounding the thermodynamic disadvantage the five hormonal systems already produce. Menopause transition deserves specific attention because it produces the most dramatic convergence of the age-related factors in the shortest time window. Over 2 to 5 years, estrogen declines sharply. The decline reduces metabolic rate independently of muscle loss. Estrogen directly influences thermogenesis in brown and beige adipose tissue. Fat redistribution from subcutaneous to visceral accelerates, and the visceral fat that accumulates produces inflammatory signals that impair insulin sensitivity, driving more fat storage, which produces more inflammation. The cycle is self-reinforcing. The woman who maintained a stable weight for 20 years and gained 8 to 10 kilograms in the 2 years surrounding menopause did not lose discipline. The hormonal environment shifted fundamentally. Metabolic rate dropped, fat distribution changed, insulin sensitivity decreased, and sleep quality declined from hot flashes and hormonal disruption, fragmenting slow-wave sleep. 4 mechanisms shifting simultaneously in one direction across a 2 to 5 year window. Well, the psychological dimension, because the 5 biological systems produce a psychological consequence that is itself a mechanism of regain. Every failed diet reinforces a narrative. I am someone who cannot control my weight. The narrative produces shame, the shame produces stress, the stress produces cortisol, and cortisol drives visceral fat storage and increases appetite through hypothalamic mechanisms. The emotional response to the biological defense becomes an additional biological driver of the weight regain, a feedback loop where psychology and physiology amplify each other. Breaking this loop requires understanding what the 5 systems are. The failure was not yours. The 5 systems were always going to produce the regain unless the approach accounted for their existence. Removing the misattribution does not remove the biology, but it removes the cortisol-driven amplification that shame was adding on top of the 5 systems. What a 300-calorie daily deficit actually looks like in food, because the number sounds abstract until translated. 300 calories is approximately 1 large muffin, or 2 tablespoons of olive oil, or 1 serving of granola with milk. The deficit that triggers the mildest defensive response is the removal of 1 item per day that you would not miss by the following morning. Not hunger, not deprivation, the removal of a single caloric contribution the body will barely register as a deficit and therefore barely defend against. Contrast with aggressive dieting is stark. Cutting 1,000 calories per day triggers the maximum defensive response across all 5 systems. Hunger surges, satiety collapses, NEAT plummets, metabolic rate overshoots downward, and the reward system makes every food encounter a negotiation the prefrontal cortex will eventually lose. Aggressive deficit produces faster initial loss and faster, more complete regain because the defense is proportional to the deficit. GLP-1 medications, semaglutide, tirzepatide, deserve mention because they represent the first pharmacological intervention that addresses the hormonal defense directly. These medications mimic the gut hormones that produce satiety, reducing the hunger drive that the leptin set point defense amplifies. They do not bypass the physics, they modify one of the 5 defense mechanisms, making the caloric deficit more tolerable. Weight regain when the medications are stopped reflects the hormonal defense, reasserting itself. The set point has not recalibrated, and removing the pharmacological suppression allows the 5 systems to resume their coordinated restoration program. Criticism that these medications are taking the easy way out reveals a misunderstanding of the fight. You are not fighting a lack of willpower. You are fighting 5 coordinated biological systems designed by 300 million years of vertebrate evolution to prevent exactly what you are trying to achieve. A medication that reduces the hunger signal from one of those systems is not weakness, it is engineering a response to a biological defense. Time, the most underrated variable. The leptin set point recalibrates over months to years of maintained weight. The first year of maintenance is the hardest because the defense is at maximum. By year 3, the body has partially accepted the new weight, hunger normalizes, satiety improves, metabolic rate partially recovers. The patience required is the time constant of hypothalamic set point recalibration, a biological process that cannot be accelerated by willpower. What maintenance actually looks like during the recalibration period is worth stating plainly, because the expectation of normal eating after a diet is the misconception that produces the most regain. During the first year of maintenance, you are not eating normally. You are eating at a level that feels like a mild deficit because the hormonal environment is still signaling depletion. The hunger that persists after reaching the target weight is not a sign that something is wrong, it is the five systems still executing the defense program. The hunger will gradually diminish over years as the set point recalibrates, but during the recalibration period, maintenance requires the conscious effort that the loss phase required. Reaching the target weight and expecting to stop dieting is expecting the hormonal defense to end at the moment they decide the weight loss is complete. The defense does not know you are done. It knows leptin is still below the historical set point, and it will continue executing the program until the set point drifts downward to match. That convergence, five independent systems, all defending one weight through different mechanisms, coordinated by a single hormone most people have never heard of, executing a survival program that cannot distinguish between a voluntary diet and an involuntary famine, is what I wish someone had explained during the decades I spent reading every regain as a character flaw rather than a predictable consequence of the biology I was living inside. Program won because it was designed to win. Understanding the program does not defeat it, but it changes one thing that matters. You stop blaming the only part of the system that was never the problem.